I was checking maintenance logs in the suffocating heat of Fort Hood, Texas. A job so tedious it could put a man to sleep. The smell of grease and hot metal was so familiar I didn't even notice it anymore. It was a completely ordinary Tuesday. Until Sergeant Perez burst in, his face as pale as if he'd seen a ghost. "White, Colonel Thompson needs to see you. Immediately. General Ward is on his way." The name hit me like a jolt of electricity. A four-star general never just stops by without a month's notice. My gut twisted into a knot. Ward was a legend, a ghost who specialized in destroying careers. When I reached the command office, Colonel Thompson was pacing like a caged animal. He wouldn't even meet my eyes. "First, Lieutenant White, you'll accompany me to receive the general. Just stand there and look presentable." His voice was cold, like he was choosing a piece of furniture. "Why me, sir?" I asked. He finally looked at me, a dismissive flick of his eyes. "Because your record is clean and you don't draw attention. Don't complicate things." The walk to the helipad was a parade of fear. I followed Colonel Thompson. The silence between us stretched as tight as a guitar string. The 100-degree Texas air felt thick enough to choke on, each step a conscious effort to maintain military bearing. As we passed the motor pool, Captain Mark Evans stepped out from between two Humvees, a smug smirk plastered on his face. He fell into step beside me just long enough to whisper, his voice dripping with condescension. "Good luck being the decoration, White." The words landed like a slap. It wasn't just an insult, it was a confirmation of my deepest fear. I wasn't here for my skills as an officer. I was here because I was unremarkable, a clean background player meant to fill a space in the lineup. I was invisible. I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck, but I locked my jaw, kept my eyes forward, and my back ramrod straight. The deafening thwump, thwump, thwump of the Blackhawk's rotors grew louder, churning the blistering air into a vortex. As the helicopter settled onto the tarmac, the rotor wash hit me like a physical blow, a hurricane of dust and grit that threatened to send me staggering. I planted my feet, my muscles straining to hold my ground. The hatch slid open, and General Alexander Ward strode out. He was exactly as the stories described. Tall, imposing, a figure carved from granite. He moved with an unnerving stillness, and he brought a wave of cold air with him that seemed to extinguish the Texas heat. Colonel Thompson snapped to attention, his hand outstretched for a shake. Ward ignored it completely. His eyes, sharp as a surgeon's scalpels, swept across the honor guard, across the trembling command staff, across everything. Then they landed on me. For a single, jarring second, our eyes met. He was 30 yards away, but I felt the weight of his gaze as if he were standing inches from me. And in that fraction of a second, the granite-like hardness in his eyes seemed to flicker. It wasn't recognition. It was something else. Something that vanished as quickly as it appeared, replaced by an impenetrable mask of command. The inspection was exactly as the legends foretold. It was hell. Ward didn't walk. He swept through the base like a force of nature. He didn't just inspect, he dissected. He pointed out a smudge of oil on the motor pool floor that no one else could see. He spotted a single misaligned button on a private's uniform from across a hangar. He reprimanded senior officers in front of their own soldiers, his voice never rising above a low, cutting monotone that was more terrifying than any shout. Colonel Thompson was sweating through his uniform, the dark patches under his arms growing with every passing minute. Captain Evans scurried around, trying to appear useful in a way that was almost comical, pointing out things Ward had already seen. His eagerness pathetic. And me? I just followed, a silent shadow in their wake. I felt like a ghost, a prop in a play I didn't understand. My purpose was to be unseen, and I was succeeding perfectly. The more invisible I felt, the more I thought of my father. First, Sergeant Daniel White. He had been a quiet man, a logistics NCO who spent 30 years in the Army moving supplies, not men. He'd never seen combat, never earned a chest full of medals. He was just a good soldier. I tried to recall what my father, who knew a surprising number of people, had once told me about Ward. The memory surfaced, faint and distant, from a conversation we'd had years ago on our back porch in Virginia. He carries heavier ghosts than any soldier I've ever known, my dad had said, staring off at the sunset. I'd never understood it. A 4-star general at the top of the world. What ghosts could he possibly have? Until now. When we reached the base's memorial wall, a simple brick structure listing the names of the fallen from recent conflicts, Ward stopped. The relentless pace of his inspection came to an abrupt halt. He stood before the wall, and the silence that emanated from him was more profound and more frightening than any of his rebukes. It was a silence filled with a pressure that made the air heavy, a silence that felt ancient and full of sorrow. He turned suddenly, his eyes finding me in the small crowd of officers. "Lieutenant," he said. His voice, for the first time, was devoid of its icy edge. It was just tired. "What does a challenge coin mean to you?" The question caught me completely off guard. Thompson and Evans shot me panicked looks. I swallowed, my throat dry. "Sir," I began, my voice steadier than I felt. "It's about legacy, honor. A symbol of the unit you served, the people you stood with. It's the bond between soldiers." I thought of my dad's coin, the one piece of his military life he'd given me. "I carry my father's," I added, the words leaving my mouth before I could stop them. An unreadable expression crossed Ward's face. An inexplicable impulse, a feeling that this was what I was meant to do, made me reach into the small pocket of my trousers. My fingers closed around the familiar, cool metal. I pulled it out. The moment Ward's eyes fell on the coin in my palm, the entire world seemed to freeze. The Texas heat, the distant hum of the base, the nervous breathing of the men around me, it all faded away. "Let me see it," he said. It wasn't an order. It was a hoarse, desperate plea. My hand was trembling as I stepped forward and carefully placed the old, worn, smooth piece of brass into the general's outstretched palm. The stone facade of his face shattered into 1,000 pieces. I saw it happen in slow motion. Shock, terror, and a grief so profound it was immeasurable. His perfectly composed features, the face that had stared down enemies of the state, crumbled like sand. "It can't be," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Lost?" He looked up at me, but he wasn't seeing a first lieutenant. He was seeing a phantom, a ghost rising from a 30-year-old grave. And then, to the absolute astonishment of Colonel Thompson, Captain Evans, and the entire command staff, General Alexander Ward, the unbreakable warrior, the living legend of the United States Army, began to weep. Silent tears carving clean tracks through the dust and time etched on his face. He grabbed my hand, his grip not one of command, but of a drowning man clinging to a piece of driftwood. "Your father," he choked out, his eyes boring into mine. "What was his name?" "Daniel White, General," I answered, my own voice a whisper. That name was the final hammer blow. I watched it land, watched the last remnant of the 4-star general disappear, leaving only a broken old man. In that instant, every certainty I had ever held about my life, my family, and the quiet, simple soldier who was my father was annihilated. The world I knew was a lie, and I felt somehow the answer was in the coin my father had left behind. Before I could process what had happened, General Ward's hand was on my arm, his grip surprisingly strong. He pulled me away from the stunned crowd of officers toward a small, nondescript administrative office nearby. He shoved the door open, guided me inside, and slammed it shut, leaving Colonel Thompson with a look of bewildered panic on his face. The room was generic, smelling of stale coffee and printer toner. Inside, the 4-star general vanished. The imposing figure on the helipad was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he was being crushed by an invisible weight. He leaned back against the door, the coin still clutched in his fist, his breathing ragged. "That coin," he said, his voice a trembling rasp. "It isn't a standard challenge coin. It's not for a unit. It's for a mission." I just stood there, my mind a blank slate of shock. "There were only 6 of them made," he continued, his eyes unfocused, looking at a past I couldn't see. "Unmarked, given only to the survivors of Operation Midnight Arrow, 1993, a mission that was wiped from every official record in the U.S. Army. The name meant nothing to me, but the implications hit me like a physical blow. "That's impossible," I said, the words coming out as a strangled whisper. "My father. He was in logistics. He was a supply sergeant. He never saw combat." The idea was absurd. My father was the man who taught me how to change the oil in my first car, who grilled perfect burgers on the 4th of July, who fell asleep in his armchair watching old westerns. He wasn't a secret operator. "He was there, Lieutenant," Ward insisted, his eyes finally meeting mine, filled with a certainty that chilled me to the bone. "Daniel White was there. He saved my life." He paused, and the look on his face twisted into something agonizing. "And I failed him." He said nothing more. He opened the door and walked out, leaving me alone in the sterile office with a secret that felt heavier than the Texas heat. When I finally stepped out of that office, the atmosphere on the base had changed. The news of General Ward's public breakdown had spread like wildfire. Whispers followed me down the hallway, and I could feel the stares of every soldier I passed. At the far end of the corridor, I saw him. Captain Evans. He was holding court with a small group of other officers. He saw me, and a slow, malicious grin spread across his face. It was the kind of smile that didn't need words. It was a verdict. I tried to ignore it. I tried to walk past, head high, but his voice carried, sharp and clear. "Quite the performance, wouldn't you say?" he remarked to his audience, loud enough for me to hear every syllable. Later, in the mess hall, the assault became more direct. I was trying to force down a dry sandwich I had no appetite for when his voice drifted over from the next table. It was oily, insinuating. Who knew Lieutenant White had the special talent to make a 4-star general cry? Some people just know how to get ahead. The implication was as vile as it was unmistakable. He was suggesting I'd use some kind of unprofessional, feminine wile to manipulate a general officer. My fork clattered against the plate. A hot, furious shame washed over me, so intense it made my vision swim. It wasn't just an insult, it was a character assassination, poisoning the well of my reputation with the oldest, ugliest kind of sexism. I was no longer a competent officer. I was a woman with a special talent. The injustice of it stole my breath. My appetite was gone. I stood up and left, the sound of their snickering following me out the door like a physical stain. The final blow came an hour later. Colonel Thompson's aide summoned me to his office. When I entered, Thompson was busy shuffling papers on his desk, refusing to look at me. "Lieutenant," he began, his voice flat and bureaucratic, "I don't know what you did out there, and frankly, I don't want to know." He finally glanced up, his eyes evasive. "But whatever this situation is between you and General Ward, you will keep it to yourself. You will not cause any more trouble for this base. Are we clear?" It wasn't a piece of advice. It was a threat, wrapped in the language of command. He didn't care about the truth. He didn't care about General Ward's distress, and he certainly didn't care about the rumors now clinging to my name. All he cared about was damage control, about keeping his own performance review pristine. The feeling of total isolation was suffocating. I was a problem to be managed, not an officer to be led. In this fight, I was completely and utterly alone. That night, sleep was impossible. I lay on my bed in my small on-base apartment, the ceiling fan stirring the thick, humid air. The poisonous words of Evans, the cowardly silence of Thompson, and the devastating secret of Ward replayed in my mind in a relentless loop. I got up and walked to my desk. I switched on the small lamp, its yellow light pooling on the worn wooden surface. I picked up my father's coin. Under the light, I could see just how worn it was, the details smoothed away by years of being carried in a pocket. It was no longer a memento, a simple keepsake from a quiet father. It was evidence, a summons. My mother had been a deeply religious woman. She died when I was in high school, but her voice was still clear in my memory. I remembered her reading from her worn Bible at the kitchen table, her finger tracing the words. A specific verse came to me then, as clear as if she were in the room. "And you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free." John 8:32. The fear that had been coiling in my gut began to recede, replaced by something colder, sharper, a cold resolve. They could whisper, They could threaten. They could try to isolate me. But they couldn't stop me from finding out who my father really was. I switched on my laptop, my fingers moving with a new sense of purpose. I started digging, looking for anything out of the ordinary around 1993. A transfer order, a change of station, anything. And then I found it. A faint, digital footprint. An old record of a family services directive issued shortly after the supposed date of Operation Midnight Arrow. It was a temporary dependency relocation order. It moved my mother and me from our home near Fort Bragg to live with my aunt in Virginia for 6 months. The reason cited was extended TDY for spouse, a temporary duty assignment. But that wasn't the shocking part. The order that had uprooted my life as a child, the one my mother always explained away as "your dad had a special project," wasn't signed by some low-level social services clerk. The seal on it, faint but unmistakable, was from the Department of Defense. I know some of you listening have felt that same sting. When someone twists your story or tries to make you feel small just to protect themselves. If you're rooting for Nicole to uncover the truth and prove them all wrong, tap that like button. And in the comments, just type a simple word, truth. Let's show her she's not alone in this fight. 2 days later, I met General Ward again. The meeting wasn't in a regular office, but in a secure briefing room in the base's command center, a CIF, a sensitive compartmented information facility. The kind of room where phones aren't allowed and the walls are designed to block electronic signals. The air inside was cold and sterile. The general looked even more worn than before, as if the weight of 30 years had settled onto his shoulders in the span of 48 hours. He didn't bother with pleasantries. He slid a small piece of paper across the polished table. On it was a single string of numbers and letters, a service number. "This was your father's original service number before 1994, he said, his voice low and gravelly. "Try to look up his service record with it. You won't find anything. But you need to see that for yourself." There was a finality in his tone that told me this was a test, a necessary step I had to take alone. That afternoon, I used my officer credentials to log into the Army's digital archives from a secure terminal in my own office. The system was vast, a labyrinth of data stretching back decades. I typed in the service number Ward had given me. My finger hovered over the enter key for a moment, a knot of apprehension tightening in my stomach. I pressed it. The screen flickered. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a single line of text appeared, stark and cold in blood-red letters against the white background. Record sealed. Requires top-level strategic clearance. My heart sank. A digital wall. Impenetrable. I tried again, using a few back-end search parameters I knew, trying to find any adjacent files, any mention of his name linked to that number. Nothing. Every path led back to that same red line of text. It was more than just a missing file. This was a deliberate erasure. Someone with immense power had reached back in time and made my father, the soldier, cease to exist. A chill that had nothing to do with the office air conditioning crept down my spine. My next stop was the base personnel office, a place that always smelled faintly of floor wax and bureaucracy. I was hoping to find a paper trail, something tangible that the digital purge might have missed. The warrant officer in charge was a middle-aged man with a perpetually bored expression, the kind of career paper pusher who had seen it all and was impressed by none of it. He looked at me over the top of his glasses as if my request to find a physical record was the most ridiculous thing he'd heard all week. "Lieutenant, there is no service record for a Daniel White prior to 94, he stated, his voice a flat monotone. He tapped a few keys on his keyboard for show. "See? Nothing. Maybe you have the name wrong." "I don't have the name wrong," I said, my voice tight with frustration. "He was my father." The officer sighed, a long put-upon sound that set my teeth on edge. The boredom on his face curdled into annoyance. "Look," he said, leaning forward slightly. "The system says it doesn't exist, so it doesn't exist. That's how it works. Now, if you'll excuse me." He turned back to his computer screen, a clear and final dismissal. I was being treated like a fool, like a confused child making up stories. The condescension was so thick I could taste it. My blood simmered, but I knew there was nothing more to be done here. He was another wall, this one made of flesh and apathy. The real warning came that night. I was walking to my car in the near-empty parking lot behind the barracks. The sun had set, and the only light came from the tall, humming sodium lamps that cast long, distorted shadows across the asphalt. White! The voice came from the darkness between two vehicles. I stopped, my hand instinctively going to my hip, a useless habit since I wasn't armed. Captain Evans stepped out of the shadows. The usual smirk was gone, replaced by a look of manufactured seriousness that was somehow more unnerving. "Evans," I said, my tone clipped. "Listen," he began, lowering his voice conspiratorially as he stepped closer. "I don't know what hornet's nest you're kicking, but word is you've been asking about old, classified files." He glanced around the empty lot. "Some things are best left alone. Some soldiers, they just want to be left to rest in peace." On the surface, it could have been a piece of friendly, if unsolicited advice. But the way he emphasized rest in peace, the dead look in his eyes, it wasn't a warning about disturbing the past. It was a threat about my future. He was a messenger, sent to tell me that digging any deeper could have fatal consequences. I felt a tremor of genuine fear. This wasn't about base gossip anymore. This was dangerous. Blocked by the system, dismissed by the bureaucracy, and now openly threatened. The walls were closing in, and a wave of near desperation washed over me. I remembered a line from a Brené Brown talk my mother had loved. Something about the courage of the wilderness. The courage to stand alone for what's right, even when the entire world is pushing back. Right now, I felt very alone. That night, back in the oppressive silence of my apartment, I made one last move. I used a secure, encrypted line to call General Ward. I told him everything. The sealed digital file, the stonewalling at the personnel office, Evans' veiled threat in the parking lot. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint sound of his breathing, the weight of his thoughts. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with resignation. "They erased the records," he said. "But they can't erase a man's memory. There's someone who knows." He was the logistics officer for the operation. Retired Colonel Marcus Hale. He signed off on the missing equipment manifests and the initial casualty reports. A name, a target, a crack in the wall. "The system won't talk to me," I said to myself after hanging up. The words a low, fierce promise in the quiet room. The bureaucracy won't help me, but one man will have to. My mind was clear now, the fear pushed aside by a singular focus. The man whose signature is at the bottom of the sealed report. The drive south from Fort Hood to San Antonio took 3 hours. 3 hours of watching the flat Texas landscape blur past my window. I drove under a steel gray sky that threatened rain, the tension in my shoulders building with every mile. I had Hale's address, but I had no idea what I would find. I was pinning all my hopes on a man who had every reason to stay silent. I found his house in a quiet, manicured suburb, the kind of place where every lawn is perfectly edged and the silence is only broken by the distant hum of a lawnmower. The house itself was immaculate, a tidy brick ranch with neatly trimmed rose bushes lining the walkway. But there was a stillness about it, a sense of loneliness that clung to the place like morning fog. I took a deep breath, walked up the concrete path, and rang the doorbell. After a long moment, the door opened a few inches. A man peered out. He was thin and stooped, with tired, haunted eyes that seemed to have seen too much. This was retired Colonel Marcus Hale. "Yes?" he asked, his voice reedy. "Colonel Hale," I began, keeping my voice even and respectful. "My name is First Lieutenant Nicole White. I'm Daniel White's daughter." The effect was instantaneous. The color drained from his face. His hand tightened on the door, and for a second, I thought he was going to slam it shut. "I don't know anything," he said quickly, his words tripping over each other. That was a long time ago. A very long time ago. His words were a denial, but the raw panic in his eyes was a confession. He knew exactly who my father was. "Sir," I said gently, holding his gaze, "I didn't come here to accuse you. I just want to know who my father was." The plea in my voice, The sincerity of a daughter searching for her father seemed to break through his wall of fear. The tension in his shoulders eased almost imperceptibly. He hesitated, his eyes darting past me to the empty street, as if checking for watchers. After a lifetime, he sighed, a sound of profound weariness, and opened the door wider. "Come in," he mumbled. He led me into a living room that was a shrine to a military career. Plaques and commendations lined the walls, and a folded American flag sat in a glass case on the mantelpiece. But everything was covered in a thin layer of dust, as if the memories were no longer celebrated, only stored. A profound sadness hung in the air. "Can I get you some tea?" he asked, his movements stiff and uncertain. "Yes, sir. Thank you." He disappeared into the kitchen, and I heard the clatter of a kettle and the running of water. I could see a fierce battle raging inside him, a war between a lifetime of following orders and the nagging demands of a 30-year-old conscience. When he returned with 2 mugs of steaming tea, his hands were trembling slightly. I decided not to press him. An interrogation would only make him shut down completely. Instead, I chose a different strategy, one based on empathy, not pressure. I simply started talking. I told him about the coin, about General Ward's shocking reaction, about the rumors that were now following me. I spoke about what it was like growing up with a father who was always present physically but emotionally distant, a man I loved but never truly felt I knew. I wasn't just giving him facts. I was showing him the human cost of the secret he was guarding. I was showing him the daughter whose life was shaped by a void she never understood. He listened in silence, his gaze fixed on the dust motes dancing in the sliver of light coming through the blinds. He didn't interrupt. He just let the weight of my story settle in the quiet room. Finally, when I was done, he spoke, his voice thick and raspy. "He was a good soldier," he said, his eyes still distant. "One of the best. The kind of NCO who saw things the officers missed." He took a shaky sip of tea. "He didn't deserve what happened to him." That was the crack in the dam. I waited, holding my breath. "They told us it was an order from the top," he continued, his voice laced with a bitter resentment that had festered for decades. "Scrub the mission, seal the records, forget it ever happened, all for national security." He practically spat the words. But that wasn't the truth. They weren't protecting the country. They were covering up a mistake, a betrayal. He finally looked at me, his eyes filled with a pained clarity. The intel for the mission was bad, fatally flawed. Your father was the only one who saw it. He was logistics. He saw the supply requests, the flight plans. He saw the inconsistencies. He tried to warn them. He tried to tell a young, arrogant Captain Ward that it was a trap. My breath caught in my chest. "But he was ignored," Hale said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He was just a sergeant, and they were officers who thought they knew better. Your father was right, and for being right, they buried him. They buried his report, his record, his entire existence before that day, because his truth was inconvenient." He fell silent then, slumping back into his chair as if the confession had drained him of all his strength. The truth of it was staggering. My quiet, unassuming father had been a hero, silenced for his integrity. For a long moment, we sat in the dusty silence, the weight of his words hanging between us. I could see the toll this secret had taken on him, the way it had hollowed him out from the inside. Seeing my sincerity, and finally crushed by the guilt he had carried for so long, Hale made a decision. He pushed himself out of his chair and walked into a back room, a study. I heard the scrape of a drawer opening. He returned a moment later, his fist clenched around something small. "I shouldn't have kept this," he said, his voice barely audible. He opened his hand and pressed a small cold object into mine. "I was ordered to destroy every piece of paper associated with Midnight Arrow. Every single file. But I couldn't. Not his." I looked down. It was an old-fashioned security key, the kind used for physical archives before everything went digital, its brass body tarnished with age. "I hid one copy," he said, looking me straight in the eye, a spark of defiance replacing the fear. "The after-action report. The original one. The one your father wrote." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Storage Unit 47C. In the basement of the Pentagon. Don't let anyone see you go in there. Getting into the Pentagon was surprisingly easy. General Ward had arranged temporary orders for me, assigning me to a review board under the cover of a routine policy meeting. To the outside world, I was just another officer doing my job. But as I badged through security and walked the endlessly long, sterile corridors, my heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Every passing officer, every glance from a civilian employee felt like an accusation. Following the map Hale had drawn for me on a napkin, I found my way to the basement levels. Down here, the polished gleam of the main concourse gave way to something older, forgotten. The air grew cool and damp, thick with the smell of old concrete and dust. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed with a lonely, monotonous hum. The corridor was long and silent. Only the sound of my own footsteps echoed, unnervingly loud in the stillness. It felt less like a government building and more like a catacomb. Storage Unit 47C was in a forgotten corner, tucked away behind a series of large ventilation ducts. It was just a plain gray metal door, indistinguishable from a dozen others, its number stenciled in faded black paint. I glanced one last time down the empty hallway before pulling the old brass key from my pocket. My hand was slick with sweat. I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, smooth click that seemed to echo in the silence. I pulled the heavy metal door open. It groaned on its hinges, a sound of protest after decades of disuse. A wave of musty air washed over me, the smell of old paper, decaying cardboard, and time itself. The room was small, barely a closet, crammed with tall gray filing cabinets. I felt like I was stepping into a tomb. I found it almost immediately, just as Hale had described. Tucked behind a row of properly labeled files for Munitions Inventories 1990-1995, there was a single, unlabeled manila folder, yellowed with age. My breath hitched. This was it. The entire history of a secret, resting in a forgotten room. My hands trembled as I lifted the folder out. I opened it. Inside was the unvarnished, uncensored truth of Operation Midnight Arrow. It wasn't just a single report. It was everything. The original mission briefing. The roster of the 6 soldiers involved, their names typed in crisp, black ink. Reconnaissance maps with objective points circled in red. And then, the most important thing of all, a detailed, handwritten log by my father, First Sergeant Daniel White. Page after page, in his neat, meticulous script, he had outlined his doubts about the intelligence source. He noted the inconsistencies in the supply requests. He questioned the illogical troop movements described by the informant. He pointed out that the timeline was too perfect, too convenient. The evidence was as clear as daylight, a blazing red flag. Someone had ignored it. I kept digging through the file, my heart pounding with a mixture of pride and sorrow for the father I was only just getting to know. At the very bottom, tucked beneath the final casualty report, was an old photograph. It was faded, the corners soft with age. A much younger, smiling version of my father had his arms slung around the shoulders of a young officer. They were both grinning, beaming with the easy confidence of youth. The officer was a young, impossibly handsome Alexander Ward. Clipped to the photo was a small folded note. The handwriting wasn't my father's familiar, careful print. It was a rushed, jagged scrawl. It was Ward's. He was right. I was wrong. My pride got them killed. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't just a confession of a tactical error. This was the gut-wrenching admission of a friend who had failed to trust his closest friend. My father, the logistics NCO, had seen the truth, and Ward, the ambitious young officer, had been too proud to listen. But the final, devastating shock was still waiting for me. Tucked inside a separate sealed envelope within the folder was another handwritten letter. This one wasn't a note. It was a full letter written on official military stationery. The handwriting was Ward's. It was addressed to my father, but it was painfully obvious it had never been sent. I unfolded the brittle paper. Daniel, I don't know if this will ever reach you. They're making me sign the final report. the one that says this was an unforeseeable intelligence failure. They say if I don't, my career is over, and the honor of the men we lost will be tarnished by a public investigation. They say I'm protecting their families from a painful truth. But we both know what the truth is. I didn't listen to you. I let the pride of a young officer blind me to what was right in front of my face. I led our men into a slaughterhouse, and I can't live with that. Alex. The air rushed out of my lungs. The truth, in its full, horrific clarity, settled over me like a shroud. There was no traitor who sold them out. There was no grand conspiracy. The tragedy was something far more mundane and far more terrible. It was the result of simple, human pride. And the cover-up. The 30 years of lies. The erasure of my father's life. It all came from the man he had called his friend. The man who chose his career over his friend's honor. This pain was sharper, deeper than betrayal. It was the agony of profound disappointment. My father hadn't been silenced by an enemy. He had been silenced by the friend he had tried to save. And that devastating sorrow, that crushing weight of disappointment, hardened in my chest. It wasn't rage, it was fuel. The fuel I would need for the confrontation that had to come next. I didn't fly back to Fort Hood. I didn't even go back to my hotel room. I stood on a windy street corner in Washington, D.C., the yellowed file clutched in my hand like a shield, and made a single phone call. General Ward picked up on the first ring. "The conference room," I said, my voice as cold and hard as the city pavement. "Tomorrow morning. 0800. I didn't need to say anything else. There was a pause on the other end, a faint intake of breath. He knew. He knew I had found it. He just said, "I'll be there." And the line went dead. The next morning, I walked into the same secure conference room where he had given me the service number. The vast mahogany table was polished to a mirror shine. He was already there, sitting alone at the far end, a solitary figure in the cavernous space. He looked like he had aged 10 years overnight. The 4-star general was gone. In his place was just a man, waiting for a judgment he knew he deserved. I didn't salute. I didn't offer a greeting. I walked the length of the table with measured, deliberate steps, my heels clicking sharply on the floor. I stopped directly across from him. And then I placed the faded manila folder on the table between us. The soft thud of the file hitting the wood echoed in the dead silence of the room like a gunshot. "My father was right," I began. My voice was unnervingly calm, a flat, level tone that carried the weight of 30 years of silence. "He warned you. It's all in here." I slid his handwritten log across the table toward Ward. The papers whispered against the wood. "But you didn't listen." I reached back into the folder and took out the photograph. I slid it after the log. It stopped beside his hand. "You were friends. Best friends," he told my mother once. My voice was still steady, but a tremor of the pain I was suppressing vibrated underneath. "He trusted you." Finally, I took out the last piece of evidence, the unsent letter. I placed it gently on top of the other documents. "And this is how you honored that trust." Each word was a precisely aimed blow, not to his body, but to his conscience. "You chose your career over your friend's honor. You buried him alive." Ward didn't look at the file. He didn't have to. The contents were clearly seared into his memory. He stared at the documents as if they were a coiled snake, ready to strike. His jaw worked silently for a moment. "Yes," he whispered, and his voice broke, shattering the last vestiges of his authority. "It's all true." And then, the final wall of his composure, the one built over a lifetime of command and control, crumbled into dust. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a self-loathing so profound it was terrifying to witness. "Do you have any idea what it's like?" he roared, the sound exploding from him, a raw, primal cry of anguish that bounced off the soundproof walls. "To wake up every morning and see a coward staring back at you in the mirror?" He surged to his feet, his hands gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles white. The rage wasn't directed at me. It was directed inward, a 30-year-old storm of guilt and shame finally breaking free. They told me it was the only way to protect the families of the fallen from the truth. that a public investigation would destroy their legacies. I believed that lie because I was too damn scared to face what I had done. His voice cracked, filled with desperation. I let my fear turn me into this monster. He sank back into his chair, the energy draining out of him as quickly as it had appeared. He looked utterly defeated. I tried to find him, he continued, his voice now a ragged, desperate whisper. Years later, when I had enough power to look, I tried to find Daniel. I wanted to beg for his forgiveness. But he was gone. He'd changed his name, moved his family. I thought he hated me. That he never wanted to see me again. You're wrong, I cut in, my own voice finally trembling, the icy control beginning to fracture. But I held my ground. He wasn't running from you. He was protecting his family from the very people who forced you to be silent. He was hiding us. Ward's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a fresh wave of pain at this new revelation. He understood now. My father hadn't abandoned him out of hatred. He had disappeared out of love and fear for us. And I failed to protect him. Ward finished, his voice breaking completely. He was utterly broken, a hollowed-out shell of the man he once was. I left him behind on the battlefield that day, and then I left him behind again, in the silence. The confession hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The entire ugly truth was finally laid bare. The room was perfectly, terribly silent. The fight was over. I had won. I had the truth. But instead of relief, all I felt was a vast, cold emptiness. I left the Pentagon without another word. I didn't look back at the broken man I left sitting in that silent, cavernous room. I didn't go back to my hotel to pack my bags. I just walked. I stepped out into the humid Washington, D.C. afternoon and started walking with no destination in mind. The city was a chaotic symphony of noise around me. The blare of car horns, the distant wail of a siren, the murmur of 1,000 conversations from the people who flowed past me on the sidewalks. But in my head, there was only a profound and unsettling silence. I had the truth. I had won. I had confronted the ghost that had haunted my family for 30 years and forced him to confess. So, why did I feel so hollow? For the past week, this mission, this singular goal of uncovering the truth, had been my entire world. It had given me purpose, direction, a target for all my years of unspoken questions. The anger I had felt at Evans, at Thompson, at the faceless system, and finally at Ward, had been a powerful fuel. It had propelled me forward, burned away my fear and doubt. Now the fire was out. And all that was left was ash. My feet, moving on their own accord, carried me toward the green expanse of the National Mall. I walked for what felt like miles, a solitary figure in uniform moving through crowds of tourists and locals enjoying the day. I didn't see them. I was adrift in a sea of my own thoughts, a ghost haunting the daylight. Eventually, I found myself standing before it. The wall. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial. A stark, black gash in the earth. A wound of polished granite that seemed to absorb the light and sound around it. It descended into the ground, a quiet, somber tribute to a generation of soldiers. Slowly, I walked down the gentle slope of the paved path, the list of names growing taller on my right until it loomed over me. The smooth, black stone reflected my own image back at me. A lone soldier, lost among the engraved names of more than 58,000 who had fallen. I reached out and pressed my palm against the cool, hard surface. The stone felt indifferent, ancient. I wasn't looking for a specific name. My father wasn't on this wall. He had survived his own war, only to be buried alive in a tomb of silence and secrets. I was just looking for connection, for some understanding of this nameless grief I carried, for him and for myself. He had been a hero in a battle no one knew about, and his only reward was to be forgotten. Standing there, I felt the profound weight of that injustice, not as an angry daughter anymore, but as a fellow soldier. I found an empty bench in the grass, facing the memorial, and sat down. I watched the people who came and went, A young couple holding hands, an old man in a wheelchair, his head bowed, a hand resting on a single name. A group of school children, their chatter a strange counterpoint to the solemnity of the place. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the 2 coins. I placed them in the palm of my hand. One was my father's, its brass body worn smooth and featureless by years of his touch. It represented a forgotten sacrifice, a silent honor. The other was the pristine, gleaming challenge coin General Ward had given me back at Fort Hood, what felt like a lifetime ago. It represented a covered-up guilt, a tarnished honor. 1 coin for the victim, 1 for the man responsible. I had thought I hated Ward. I had walked into that room wanting to destroy him, to make him feel a fraction of the pain he had caused. But when I saw him break, when I heard the raw agony in his confession, the hatred evaporated. All I saw was a pathetic, broken man, imprisoned not by walls of stone, but by the walls of his own mistake. A mistake he had been reliving every single day for 30 years. And then a devastating thought struck me. He was the last person on earth who truly knew my father, not the quiet logistics sergeant, but the brave, perceptive soldier who had tried to save his friends. That connection, that shared memory, was a fragile thread linking me to a past I had just discovered. The anger was gone. In its place was a deep, aching sadness and a single, paralyzing question. What now? Justice, in a way, had been served. The truth was out, at least between the 2 of us. I could get on the next flight back to Fort Hood, return to my life, and leave the past, and the broken man who embodied it, behind me forever. I could put the folder in a safe deposit box and never look at it again. Or, I could go back. I could walk back into that room. Not as Lieutenant White, confronting a 4-star general. Not as an accuser, facing the guilty party. But simply as a daughter, facing the last living friend of her father. I looked at the 2 coins gleaming in my hand. One path was escape, the other felt like something else. Something harder, but maybe, just maybe, something closer to peace. I thought of a quote from Martin Luther King Jr. that my history teacher in high school had drilled into us. Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. My fight had been about bringing the truth to light, but maybe the healing wasn't in the truth itself. Maybe it was in what came after. I closed my hand around the 2 coins, the cool metal a solid, reassuring weight. I could get on the next plane and never look back. Or I could go back to that room, not as a soldier, but as a daughter. I chose the latter. I walked back into the Pentagon conference room. It felt different this time. The air wasn't charged with tension, but thick with a heavy, sorrowful stillness. General Ward was exactly where I had left him, sitting motionless in his chair, a statue of regret. He looked smaller, diminished, lost in the vastness of the room. He heard my footsteps and looked up. His eyes, red-rimmed and exhausted, widened with a flicker of surprise, and then, something I couldn't quite decipher. It looked like a fragile sliver of hope. I didn't return to my seat across the table from him. That was the seat of an adversary. Instead, I walked around the long mahogany table, pulled out the chair directly beside him, and sat down. The simple act changed everything. It erased the battle lines. It was no longer a confrontation. It was a vigil. We sat in silence for a long time, but it wasn't the suffocating, hostile silence of before. It was a silence of acceptance, a quiet space where the storm had passed and we were left to survey the wreckage together. Finally, I broke the quiet. My father left a letter, I said, my voice soft. I reached into my pocket, but I didn't pull out the file of evidence. I pulled out a different envelope. It was the one I had taken from my childhood home, the one my mother had given me, with my father's familiar handwriting on the front, addressed simply to Alex. The letter I now understood was meant to be found after his death. The one I hadn't yet read to its intended recipient. Ward watched me, his expression unreadable, as I carefully unfolded the old, creased paper. I took a steadying breath and began to read aloud, my voice the only sound in the room. Alex, I read, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone. It also means my daughter found you, and for that, I am sorry. I never wanted her to carry this burden. I paused, my own throat tightening, before I continued. You're probably thinking you failed me. You didn't. You were a young, proud captain, and I was a stubborn sergeant. We did the best we could with what we knew. Don't carry a guilt that isn't yours to bear alone. The real failure belongs to the men who chose silence over honor, not you. Ward was listening, his body rigid, his hands clenched into fists on the table. Tears were streaming down his face again, but these were different from the jagged, painful tears of before. These were quiet tears of release, of an absolution he never believed he would receive. I read the final lines, my own voice thick with emotion. I forgive you, Alex. I always did. Now go and live a life worthy of the men we lost. That's the only honor they need. The last word hung in the air. The room was filled with the voice of a man 30 years gone, a voice of grace and forgiveness from beyond the grave. Ward finally broke, a ragged sob escaping his lips. He buried his face in his hands. I don't deserve this, he choked out, his shoulders shaking. My father thought you did, I replied gently. And that's what matters. I reached into my pocket one last time and took out my father's coin, the worn, smooth piece of brass that had started this whole journey. I placed it on the table and pushed it toward him. It slid across the polished wood and came to a stop in front of his trembling hands. His last wish, I said, remembering the note he'd left with the letter, was for this to go to the person who needed it most. I think, after 30 years, it's finally found its way home. Ward slowly lowered his hands and stared at the coin as if it were a holy relic. He reached out and picked it up, closing his fingers around it tightly, a lifeline in a sea of grief. He held it for a long moment, his eyes shut. When he opened them, he looked at me. And for the first time, I wasn't being looked at by a general. The rank, the power, the guilt. It was all gone. He looked at me with the eyes of an old friend of my father's, the eyes of an uncle seeing the niece he never knew he had. His gaze was filled with a profound, heartbreaking sorrow and an equally profound gratitude. He didn't say anything. There were no words left. Instead, he slowly reached out his hand, not to shake mine, but simply placed it on my shoulder. It was a hesitant, gentle touch. And as it rested there, I felt something shift inside me. The weight of his hand didn't feel like the burden of authority, or the touch of a man who had wronged my family. For the first time in my life, it felt like the warmth of a father. A new connection, fragile but real, was being forged in the ashes of the past. A bridge was being built across a 30-year chasm of pain and silence. Everything was beginning to change. A few weeks after that day in Washington, the news filtered through the Army grapevine. General Alexander Ward had quietly submitted his papers for retirement. There was no grand ceremony, no farewell parade, no laudatory speeches. One of the most decorated generals of his generation simply faded from public life. It was his choice. Back at Fort Hood, the rumor mill went into overdrive. Captain Evans and his cronies concocted wild theories over beers at the officers' club, speculating about health issues or some hidden political scandal. They never came close to the truth. But for me, Ward's silent departure was the final, necessary act of penance. The power he had clung to, the power that had enabled the 30-year lie, was the price of his atonement. He had voluntarily relinquished it. He had chosen honor, at last. A month later, a small, heavy package arrived for me from the Department of the Army. I opened it in the privacy of my apartment. Inside, nestled in a velvet-lined case, was a silver star. The citation, engraved on a brass plate, posthumously awarded the medal to First Sergeant Daniel White for extraordinary courage and clear-headed analysis under extreme duress during Operation Midnight Arrow. Tucked beneath the medal was an official letter from the Department of Defense. It was a formal acknowledgement of his sacrifice, a correction of his service record, and an official apology for the clerical errors that had erased his early career. It was the last act Ward performed as a 4-star general. Before he retired, he had moved mountains to restore his friend's name. I lifted the medal from its case. The silver star felt heavy and real in my hand. I clutched it to my chest, and for the first time in what felt like my entire life, I cried tears of pure, unadulterated happiness. My father's honor was finally home. The following spring, Alex, he had insisted I call him that, drove down to Texas. He didn't come to Fort Hood. Instead, I met him in San Antonio. Together, we drove to the Fort Sam Houston National Cemetery. It was a warm, clear day, with a gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the ancient oak trees that shaded the grounds. The cemetery was a vast, peaceful expanse of green, dotted with rows upon rows of simple white headstones, a silent testament to generations of service. We found my father's grave in a quiet section near the back. The headstone was simple, just his name, rank, and the dates of his life. For a long time, we just stood there, the silence comfortable between us. We weren't a retired general and a first lieutenant. We were just two people, bound by the memory of the man who lay beneath the grass. Alex reached out and placed a hand gently on the top of the cool, white stone. "Hello, old friend," he said, his voice thick with emotion, cracking on the last word. "I'm sorry I'm so late." He told me stories then, standing in the warm Texas sun. Stories about my father I'd never heard. About how Daniel White, a quiet kid from rural Virginia, could fix any engine with nothing but a wrench and sheer stubbornness. About how he had a wicked sense of humor that only came out when you least expected it. He told me about the time they'd borrowed a colonel's Jeep for a joyride and had to spend a week on kitchen duty as punishment. He was giving me back the pieces of my father that the silence had stolen. That evening, Alex took me to dinner. It wasn't a fancy, upscale restaurant. It was a classic Texas steakhouse, a noisy, bustling place with checkered tablecloths, country music playing on the jukebox, and the incredible smell of grilled meat hanging in the air. The kind of no-frills, honest-to-goodness place my dad would have loved. For the first time, we didn't talk about the past. We talked about the future. My future. He asked about my career goals, my dreams, what I wanted out of my life in the Army. He listened with an intensity and a genuine interest that I had rarely experienced. He wasn't just a general or a mentor, he was becoming family. As I was telling him about a field exercise I was scheduled to lead, I was distracted by a burst of laughter from the table next to us. A young family, a dad in uniform, a mom, and two small kids, was celebrating a birthday. The little boy, who couldn't have been more than 7, was trying to blow out the candle on a huge slice of chocolate cake, his cheeks puffed out with effort. His sister was giggling, and his parents were watching him with faces full of uncomplicated love. Watching them, a profound realization settled over me. My journey, my fight for the truth, had been for me. It had been about healing my own past, but it couldn't end there. The peace I had found, the honor I had reclaimed for my father, it had to mean something more. It had to be the beginning of something else. Nicole knew her story couldn't end here. It had to be the beginning of theirs. 1 year later. I stood on the stage in the auditorium of my old high school in Virginia. The room was filled with students, their faces a sea of youthful curiosity. The air smelled exactly the same as I remembered, a mixture of floor wax, chalk dust, and teenage restlessness. I was a captain now, my uniform crisp, the silver bars on my collar gleaming under the stage lights. Down in the front row, Alex Ward sat watching me, a quiet, proud smile on his face. He looked more at peace than I had ever seen him. I gripped the sides of the lectern, took a breath, and addressed the students. "Good morning. Today I'm here to announce the creation of the Daniel White Scholarship Fund." I glanced at Alex and he gave me a subtle nod of encouragement. This scholarship, funded entirely by the pension of retired General Alexander Ward, is for the children of veterans who face hardship. It's for the families of the quiet soldiers, the logistics NCOs, the mechanics, the cooks, the ones whose stories often go untold, but whose service is the bedrock of our entire military. I looked out at the young faces, some attentive, some bored, and I set my prepared notes aside. I decided to speak from the heart. "My father was a quiet soldier," I said, my voice clear and strong. "He never told me any war stories. Instead, he taught me that honor isn't about the medals you wear on your chest, but about the truths you're willing to defend in your heart." My journey over the past year has taught me a lot, but the most important lesson is this. The deepest scars don't come from the enemy you face, but from the secrets you keep from the people you love. I let that sink in for a moment. But it also taught me that it is never, ever too late to tell the truth. It's never too late to forgive. And it's never too late to heal. After the assembly, as students were filing out, a young girl, maybe 10 or 11 years old, approached me hesitantly. She was clutching her books to her chest. "My dad was a soldier too," she said, her voice small. "Sometimes, he gets really sad." Her simple, honest words went straight to my heart. I knelt, bringing myself down to her eye level. "I understand," I said softly. "My dad was like that too." I reached into my uniform pocket and pulled out the coin. Not the one Alex carried now, but my own. The one I had been given at officer candidate school. The one that had started this journey. It was polished and gleaming. I pressed it into her small hand. "Give this to him," I said, closing her fingers around it. "And tell him something for me. Tell him his story matters, and tell him that someone is listening." The little girl's eyes went wide. She nodded, clutching the coin as if it were a precious treasure, and then she ran off to find her friends. I watched her go, a feeling of profound rightness settling over me. The final scene of this chapter of my life unfolded a few months later. Alex and I were walking together through the Memorial Garden at Fort Hood as the sun began to set. It was the magic hour, and the setting sun cast a warm golden glow over everything, painting the Texas sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. The air was calm and quiet, the sounds of the bustling base muted by the evening. We walked in comfortable silence for a while, two soldiers, one old, one young, at peace. "He would be so proud of you, Nicole," Alex said, his voice filled with a quiet warmth. I smiled, looking out at the horizon. "I think he'd be proud of both of us," I replied. And in that moment, I knew it was true. I was no longer a victim of my past, haunted by questions I couldn't answer. And Alex was no longer a prisoner of his guilt, shackled to a 30-year-old mistake. We were survivors. More than that, we were architects. We had taken the broken pieces of a tragedy and built a legacy from them. A legacy of truth, forgiveness, and hope. The story ends there. With the image of us walking together into the sunset, shoulder to shoulder, no longer defined by the ghost of the man who had brought us together, but instead, carrying his true spirit forward in our hearts. My journey began with a single coin and a single question. It ended with the powerful truth that every story, no matter how quietly it was lived, has the power to heal. Maybe there's a story like that in your own family. A quiet hero? A question you've always wanted to ask. A truth waiting for the light. This channel is dedicated to bringing these important stories to life. If you believe in the power of truth and healing, please subscribe to join our community. And if this story resonated with you, consider sharing it with someone you know whose own story matters. Thank you for listening.